Nagas fight on both sides. They're in partisan units allied with the British, and the Naga nationalist leader, Angam Muzafi Fizo, allies with the Japanese. This is the Battle of Kohima is like a months-long siege, almost 3 months. The region is being bombed and also under siege, and basically is able to continue to survive because of American air support being flown out of Kolkata. This is a moment when this so-called peripheral region is central to global politics. So that's the first element. The second is religion. Nagaland is, well, I'm going to use some numbers that may or may not be accurate because the Indian government hasn't done a census since 2011. But based on that, Nagaland is 90% Christian and 75% Baptist. For comparison, the American state of Mississippi is 34% Baptist. So this makes Nagaland the most Baptist state in the world, if we want to think of this. By state, I mean state within the Indian Union, which Nagaland has been since 1963. Nagaland is Baptist because of a handful of American Baptist missionaries who arrived in the late 1880s. However, there were never more than 5, 6, 7, 8, not very many. And after Indian independence in the years following, their visas were not renewed. So the sort of incredible rise in Baptist Christianity in the region really was because of Naga missionaries, not American. But this means, this is, you think of South Asia, you think of Hindu versus and Muslim, tensions, but also that those are the two dominant religions. This is a region where those are not the dominant religions. Those are not the dominant forms of culture. So that's the second aspect to realize. And with that comes increased English language education and being plugged in to global religious networks. Billy Graham comes to Nagaland in the 1970s as part of one of his crusades. So this is a form of global connection that remains ongoing. The third is anthropology. I don't know how many anthropologists we have in the room, or if anyone has read Bernard Cohen, that famous anthropologist, but he describes certain regions as anthropology land, where they are so well studied by anthropologists that that's how they're understood. Nagaland is like that under British Empire. There are several anthropologists, some of whom are colonial civil servants as well, who make this region one of the best studied places from an anthropological perspective. And therefore, understandings of tribe and identity really are kind of codified through anthropological categorization. This matters because the Indian Constitution has a list of, or schedule of tribes and castes. I'm not talking about caste today. I can in the Q&A. Which is actually written by one of these anthropologists who takes Indian citizenship after independence. So this is how Nagas are categorized within India and understood externally. So if we need to know 3 things about Nagaland to sort of move forward, it's that experience of the Second World War, the high rates of Baptist Christianity, and tribal anthropological categorization. As you can see, the last 2 don't seem to fit together. One is about exposure to forms of Western civilization, and the other is this idea of sort of pre-modern, not quite civilized, not quite ready for self-government. And so those are the kinds of tensions that you see at play with the Naga claim. So after Indian independence in 1947, there's the first Indian general election in 1951, and Nagas boycott it, and they declare their own independence actually officially the day before Indian independence in August 47. So in their nationalist conceptions, they are not a secessionist movement. They are coterminous with the Indian state, to use a big word. But from the mid-1950s onwards, insurgency breaks out in the region, the Indian government comes in, and the Naga nationalist leader, Angami Zapu Fizo, walks to East Pakistan. East Pakistan is not yet Bangladesh. That happens later on in 1971. So this image is actually from 1960, 1961, taken by one of the few journalists of any nationality who snuck in, and it's image of Naga nationalist insurgents. And if we have war buffs in the room, everything they have is from the Second World War. So that left over. So the insurgency was really in some ways a continuation of that wartime experience. And the second image is of a nationalist camp in Kohima that I took this picture from 2016. And this is one of the peace camps. These are handed over to particular nationalist parties or nationalist movements by the Indian government through peace negotiations, and it's sort of in some ways a remnant of that history of insurgency in the region. So this is the nationalist claim. Fizo, Angami Zapu Fizo, the Naga nationalist leader, walks to East Pakistan in the late 1950s. Then he arrives in Switzerland in the summer of 1960. His travel facilitated by the Pakistani government. And there he works to make contact with Western advocates who work supporting anti-colonial nationalism all over the world. So these advocates, there are a lot of them, and I talk about a range of them in the book. But today, I'm going to talk specifically about those from the international peace movement, who form an organization called the World Peace Brigade in 1961, specifically to help decolonization escape what they call its entrapment in violence. The three leaders you may have heard of from other contexts. A.J. Muste is American, prominent religious left leader, very active in the U.S. civil rights movement, mentor of Baird Rustin and Bill Sutherland, and he actually is he runs a Liberation magazine, which is a sort of prominent sort of journal from that sphere in that era, and the background image is one of the covers from Liberation magazine. Jayaprakash Narayan is a Indian politician and peace activist. If you would have heard of him, you might have heard of him as a leader in the Indian independence movement, and then later on in the 1970s, he emerges as Indira Gandhi's great opponent during the Indian emergency, which is when the Indian Prime Minister suspends civil liberties and certain rules of law. JP then re-enters Indian electoral politics at that moment when he's quite old. During this period, the early 1960s, JP is not part of formal politics, but he has a huge international profile. The U.S. government records about this view JP as the successor of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. No one in India would have thought that that would ever happen. And so this shows more about American misconceptions about Indian politics rather than an actual kind of diagnosis of the Indian political environment. But what it does show is JP's really large international profile. And he supports anti-colonial nationalism in East Africa. East Africa also has a very large South Asian diaspora community in Tanganyika, Tanzania, in Kenya, and elsewhere. And then the final figure of this triumvirate who formed this organization, the World Peace Brigade, is Reverend Michael Scott, not the character from The Office. He is he's an Anglican minister, he's a British anti-apartheid activist, and I'm going to spend some time talking about him because he's a really interesting figure. And he is the one who makes contact with Fizeau in Switzerland and brings him to the UK. He's able to actually get him across the British border by under this label of former imperial citizen, which is not a legal category, and you cannot enter really any country, let alone the UK, under that category today. But Scott, over 6 feet tall, wearing his dog collar, is able, and with quite powerful patrons, is able to get Fizeau into the UK and support his international claims-making efforts. Now, this is a problem for the World Peace Brigade because here's JP working with a host of other Indians in the Indian peace movement, and they're not so interested in supporting what they construe as a secessionist movement within India, one that engages in violence, one that's blowing up trains, allegedly. So this is a very kind of fraught moment for what this advocacy network can and cannot do. And Scott's really taking up the Naga claim really ends up fracturing the network long term. And the work they've done kind of dissolves as with their personal friendships. One final note on Michael Scott. If you had heard of him, you would have heard of him as an anti-apartheid activist against apartheid South Africa. And he's working in Tobruk outside of Johannesburg shortly after the Second World War, and he's protesting racist land tenure acts against black South Africans and also South Asians. And he's brought by the Indian delegation at the United Nations to testify on behalf to explain what's going on in South Africa. The Herero people of Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, hear about this, and they have Scott represent them at the United Nations because Southwest Africa is one of those weird places that actually has access to the United Nations because it's a former League of Nations mandate. We can leave that be. I'll explain that later when we get to global processes. But Scott is a veteran UN petitioner on behalf of Southwest Africa, brought into the room in part by the Indian delegation. And so when his support of the Naga cause ends up fracturing this network, these friendships, it ends up being quite devastating, both personally and professionally. So I want to talk a bit about what's actually happening, and I'm using these words: League of Nations, United Nations, these big forms of international order. And if there are German readers and speakers in the room, I want to apologize for the 1930 German language map I'm showing because the map key has some very inappropriate language. But there's a reason why I'm showing this map. This map from 1930 of oppressed peoples of the world was made by the Hungarian map maker Alexander Rado. He was also a Soviet spy. And it maps peoples based on ethnicity and where they're located. And so it's a really kind of incredible map because it's mapping African Americans in the United States. It's mapping Indians in South Asia and also, sort of Indo-Burmese peoples in South Asia. It's mapping indigenous and black communities in South America. It's mapping in ways we usually do not see. And this is a map. This is a Soviet map. This is a communist map, mapping basically the proletariat's disenfranchisement. It's also an interwar era map. I mentioned this thing called the League of Nations. Many of you in the room would have heard of it, but after the First World War, the great powers, the victors of the First World War, came together and tried to prevent another world war from happening. And one of the things they had to do was to deal with the former colonies and territories of the German, Habsburg, and Ottoman empires. And the German Empire had colonies in East Africa and also Southern Africa, German Southwest Africa. And the League of Nations made these into mandates, which in some ways, according to the people living on the ground, was no different than being a colony. But in terms of actually having an international legal framework where the mandatory power, which for Southwest Africa was South Africa, had to justify their rule based on, kind of civilizational metrics of development and education. Now, we can talk about that as kind of window dressing for continued empire. But in practice, it actually gave a portal for peoples from these regions to make claims in international politics. The United Nations order after the Second World War got rid of that, except for a couple strange vestiges from the League. And one of them was Southwest Africa, that was internationally categorized as a former League of Nations mandate. And this meant that they had their own UN committee. The other map I'm showing is a U.S. Central Intelligence Agency map from 1962, showing the countries that have become independent between 1943 and 1962. And I'm showing this map not so much for what it demonstrates, but for what it's hiding. Hiding in white are the countries that are still colonies and the countries that are metropoles, are still empires. So this map hides as much as it shows. So even though it's allegedly showing independence, it's also hiding continued empire. And what the book is really about is that the world of 1930, disenfranchised peoples remain within these new post-colonial states. That that independence is an internationally legal structured layer that then covers up continued inequities. I said I wanted to talk about Michael Scott, and that is because he's a really interesting guy, a bit cranky, and also really sort of a central figure in how we get from Nagaland to Southern Africa to the United Nations, to London and beyond. This image of Scott is very much that of what one might think of kind of the classic Western savior, where you see he has his dog collar and he also has his sort of almost colonial era dungarees on over that. I mentioned that he was the spokesman for Namibian nationalist claims making, which he was, and here he is with Mburumba Karina, a Namibian nationalist claimant at the United Nations. He spoke regularly at the United Nations on behalf of Namibian nationalists, and then in the late 1960s, he actually ends up going to Nagaland to try to broker a peace between Naga nationalists and the Indian government. And this really, he's there with his friend Jayaprakash Narayan, and it does not go very well. The Indian government has no need to, and lots of reasons not to recognize any form of protected autonomy or anything that might give Nagas forms of self-rule. In this flexibility, the seeming flexibility of decolonization really isn't there, especially in Southern Asia in the 1960s. The window of opportunity really is on the African continent, and that's why this book, while it's framed by the Naga claim, really spends a lot of time in Southern Africa, because that's really the epicenter of the issues that nationalist claimants and their transnational advocates are grappling with during this period of time. And I want to read a little bit about what Scott tries to do and isn't able to in Nagaland. So he gets deported in May 1966. And this is, when you think of the Indian delegation at the UN bringing him there in the late 1940s, this is really like the end of an era, an end of the kind of collaboration that advocates were able to carry out on behalf of nationalist claimants. And so writing here, Scott he's grappling with, in some ways, the failure of the world he tried to build. He believed that the most powerful weapon he wielded for his causes was selflessness. He did not go to Nagaland to fight for the Naga cause. He went to try and make it possible for diametrically opposing groups of human beings to confront one another in argument and reason it out. Selflessness, apolitical positioning remained key. If one acts disinterestedly, something miraculous can come of it. The Nagas do get a bit of a respite. South Africa does have to begin to change regarding Southwest Africa. It is not miraculous as usually understood. It is the normal process of creation. Scott's aims here, I think, are really interesting because on the one hand, they're quite modest. Let's just get a ceasefire. Let's just stop the violence. On the other hand, he actually wants to remake the United Nations order so it will recognize the claims of peoples and not just those of states. And this is a moment where he is grappling with his failures in Nagaland, and also he was pursuing an international legal strategy for Namibian independence at the International Court of Justice, which made basically a non-decision in 1966 on that. Happy to talk about that further in the Q&A if folks are interested. But in wrestling with his failures, he actually writes to a friend of his, who's the anthropologist Laura Thompson. And she's the person who first brought the Naga claim to his attention. She actually was an anthropologist of Melanesia. She worked in Guam for the US military during the Second World War. She spoke on behalf of the Chamorro people of Guam at the American Congress. So she is very much part of this community. So even as I talk specifically about Scott, it's important to realize that he was, while a unique figure in many ways, he moved with many fellow travelers. And she says, she basically says, calm down, it's all right, you did the best you can. But then she says, in some ways you've surely done more than your share. And the problem now is to see that none of your work is lost so far as the Nagas and the Southwest Africans are concerned. What's most important is that the burden of leadership must shift to Native shoulders. And she argues really that the indigenization of this kind of advocacy work was a necessary decolonization with all of that processes, promise, limits, and impossibilities. So Scott, in some ways, positioning himself as this kind of savior figure is emblematic of the limits of the Naga, of the claims he supports. If they're negotiating with him and using him to access the United Nations, they're not negotiating with governments. They're not getting, support from development organizations. So this advocacy was really double-edged in that it was absolutely integral for how claimants entered politics, but it also could really kind of undercut their autonomy. Independence also meant independence from advocacy. And I want to talk a bit about how this all kind of fits together. So here is the map of decolonization, the map that hides as much as it shows. Here is a sort of artistic depiction of what I consider sort of the intersection of claims making and advocacy. It's from A.J. Musty's Liberation magazine, made by the same artist who painted the other cover I showed. And it shows two circles, but that aren't aligned and that are racially marked. And in some ways, the relationship between claims making and advocacy was that. They were working together, but they were not in the same circle. Another image of this is from one of my research trips to Windhoek, Namibia. And it is a literal intersection, not a figurative one. It is an intersection between Reverend Michael Scott Street and Sam Nujoma Drive in Windhoek. This is from 2015. Sam Nujoma was the leader of the dominant Namibian nationalist movement and the president of independent Namibia in 1990. So when I saw this, I was really excited because here was a literal intersection between claims making and its advocacy. And it was located at a construction site. And research, if anything, is it is a construction site. So, these are really ways of thinking about these sort of complicated, convoluted, but very, very personal relationships at kind of the level of structure. And so in closing, I want to put these concepts, these big isms together. And I'm not going to take them sequentially this time. But let's think about process. And what matters here is the map of 1930, the map of those disenfranchised communities remains with the map of 1962, and frankly remains with us today. Communities remain unliberated within independent states, and they frame their claims in all sorts of ways. The book really ends with a turn to indigenous claims making by some of these communities, and looking towards indigeneity as a language with potential international ramifications. The second aspect, these claims, which is really that these claims first, they remain ongoing, as I said, but they also remain really practical and in sometimes very surprising ways. I mean, I talked about the World Peace Brigade and transnational advocates drawn from the international peace movement. Elsewhere in the book, I talk about the role of corporations, the role of retired colonial officials working on behalf of particular claimants. So the practicality and the evolution of these claims. And the third is really about advocacy, that it requires its own decolonization. And if that doesn't happen, well, it can be a dead end. When I saw that intersection of Reverend Michael Scott Street and Sam Nujoma Drive at the construction site, I was really excited. A couple years later, I talked to a Namibianist friend in Windhoek, and I said, "What's going on at that? What did they build at that intersection?" And he said, "Well, it's now a dead end. It's a parking lot." I thought, well, okay. Sometimes the intersection between claims making and its advocacy does not necessarily lead to the construction of independence. Thank you. And my email's here. I'm very happy to be contacted on these questions, and please download the book.
Thank you. We sure appreciate that great presentation. If you do have a class you need to get to by 1 o'clock, you can be excused, but we hope that many of you will stay for our conversation. I also want to just note that if you're a student who would like to speak more with Professor Walker, that we will have a student discussion today at 4 p.m. In the conference room just across from the lobby, and you're invited to participate in that if you would like. It's pretty rare in academic publishing to have an open access book at such a prestigious journal, and so take advantage of the QR code to download that book. I invite you now to consider questions you might have for our presenter. And if you have a question, just raise your hand. We have two gentlemen on each side of the room with microphones. They will bring you a microphone. We ask you to stand and tell us who you are as you ask your question. And we will go until 1 p.m. I'm just going to actually take advantage of maybe just asking the first question, if it's all right, and then we'll open it up. I'm interested in the question about what might have been different. Thinking about the counterfactual, if we imagine Nagaland's claims making as successful, and that we looked at this map over here and there was something there in colored boundaries representing the Naga people, what would have needed to be different? I know that's a difficult question in many ways to answer because it requires imagination, creativity, and we're dealing outside of factual history. But I'm curious, based on your research, is there a world in which there is a Nagaland on the map, and what would have needed to be different for it to be there? Thanks.
Thank you, Quinn. I actually love counterfactuals. A lot of historians don't, but I find they're really fun ways to actually think historically. And so for this one, what would have had to have happened? India and Pakistan would have had to have been formed totally differently. And this isn't actually, at the moment of, in the debates surrounding it, South Asian independence for India and Pakistan, people were talking about that. I mean, first of all, for those in the room, you have to realize that I'm going to talk specifically about India, but when I'm talking about colonial India, that includes Pakistan and Bangladesh, is that you have to think of India like Europe. It's so diverse in terms of ethnicity, language, culture, religion, and their also empire was incredibly uneven. India was full of these princely states that basically controlled themselves domestically and just didn't have their own foreign policy, but had forms of sovereignty. Some of them were represented at the League of Nations. They participated in certain of those forums. India also included the Portuguese colony of Goa, the French colony of Pondicherry, and it also included what were called excluded areas, like the Naga Hills, where colonialism was really light, not much. You know, for Nagas, part of what led them to reject the independent Indian state was that Indian independence was much more coercive on the ground than British Empire had been, because of just the number of people and the Indian state-making project. You also have to realize that China invades Northeast India and Kashmir in 1962. There's a war in 71 with Bangladesh. The piece of land that connects the Northeast to what Northeasterners will call mainland India, the Siliguri corridor, is called the chicken's neck in Indian security circles because it can always be snapped by invasion. So that this is, there are these unevennesses of empire that were sort of forcibly evened out by independence. And it didn't have to happen in that way. You could have had a constitutional convention where representatives of all these units came and negotiated their shape. It would have you probably would not have ended up with 2 and then 3 states. You might have ended up with a looser federation, or maybe that would have been too loose. Like the Articles of Confederation, you would have ended up with a new constitution. But I think it's helpful to think about those things and to problematize the moment of independence, and that what we ended up with was not a given, that there were other options on the table and people were thinking with them. And communities who then rejected the settlement of independence, in part why they were is because they knew the options that had been on the table and were shut out.
Thank you so much for that. My name is Jacob Hickman. I'm one of those lurking anthropologists. And I work in what my interlocutors would call Hmong land. So there's a Hmong representation in the UNPO, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization. There's a Nagalim contingency. I've actually met with the Hmong representative to the UNPO. And I wonder what you think about the UNPO as sort of like, in some ways, I suppose, like the contemporary like outgrowth of this sort of like alternative sovereignties advocacy, right? And what you think about that is, I guess, I don't know, how does that factor into your research as a potential, like, I guess, the current purveyor of this type of advocacy, and how you think about that?
Well, thank you so much. I'm surprised to be asked about the UNPO, but I'm thrilled to talk about them. So this is the Unrepresented Peoples Organization, and I think Ralph Bunche III is their general secretary, so which is almost a sort of deliberate flip from the UN Secretary General. This is an organization that I believe was started in the 1990s. And some members of it became independent with the end of the Soviet Union. So there was kind of a period in the early 90s where the UNPO was kind of sort of it wasn't just that it was an organization for what I call states in waiting, but it was, some of them were becoming independent. Now, my understanding is sort of the biggest thing they do is a soccer football tournament. But they've had some, I've spent a little bit of time with their papers. I didn't actually write about them for the book, but I could have. For those in the room who've written books, you know this. For those in the room who haven't, I'll say it. A book is basically this giant iceberg, and then there's a little bit that's actually in the book that's peeking out from the sea. But entities like UNPO are very much part of this sphere, especially if you take these dynamics into the 1990s. I think when we talk about decolonization, or in my own teaching, I talk about sort of 3 waves after the Second World War. First is late 40s, early 50s in predominantly Asia. Second is late 50s into the 1970s on the African continent. And then the third is the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and it's not accidental that that's when apartheid also heads towards its end date and when Namibia becomes independent. So that 90s moment with UNPO is part of that story. So thanks a lot, and I'm happy to talk about this more.
Okay, so I'm Joey Stewart in the history department, and one of the things that I find really interesting is that thinking about where your source base is from, because so many of these entities don't become nations and thus don't have their own archives in the same way that other nation states do. Could you tell us a little bit about your process in finding documents that you were able to find and analyze, and where those repositories might be?
Thanks, Joey, and I promise that question wasn't planted, but it's something I'm thrilled to talk about. And I want to make a plug as well, but first I'll talk about my actual sources. I first want to say that this is the kind of book I don't know if could be written, or I don't know if the research could be done, or certainly not in the same way, since not just the pandemic, but also changing political environments. I had altogether, and also changing funding environments. I had altogether 24 months of research on 4 continents. One of the things about the book I'm thrilled about is that it has proper footnotes, and you can see all that research on every page. That's not really, the research environment is not like that anymore. And secondly, where these records are located is really interesting. Advocates are definitely the richest repository of these papers. Michael Scott has like over 100 boxes at Oxford. Lots of people wanted to write biographies of them, most of them didn't, and then you have all the interviews they did with his friends and colleagues that are also part of those sources. Those are incredibly rich. But there also are, I found a lot in church libraries in Nagaland and Assam, in individuals' living room cabinets in Nagaland. So it was a whole range of the kinds of sources I was able to use. One interesting aspect is what gets circulated. So Scott wrote this editorial for the Observer newspaper in 1960 on the issue of minorities within post-colonial states, basically the issue of what I call states in waiting. I found that editorial in people's living room cabinets in Nagaland. I found it in the Namibian National Archives. I found it in the Observer's archives at The Guardian, where one would expect to find it. So you could see the kind of global circulation of certain documents. The others is Naga nationalists made a lot, really were into documenting alleged Indian atrocities. And so you have lists of those atrocities, and they wanted the war in the region to be understood outside. And these lists are in English because these lists are meant to be they're typed. You know, you have like one typewriter in the jungle and they're typing these lists, and they're meant to be circulated outside. So there's a real kind of interesting stuff going on with the creation in country of documents that are meant to be shown outside. And the other is, you see these Naga letters, Naga petitions in the state archives of lots of different places. And I have to say that I'm really grateful for colleagues who would say be working in the Israeli state archives and be like, yeah, I found this Naga letter here, because I wasn't going to be working there. So sometimes, you have that kind of serendipity. And I want to make a plug in particular because I'm not the only kind of researcher who does this. When we do archival research, and not just archival interviews, when we are doing this research, we are creating archives. And I think we can all be more kind of transparent with ourselves about that. Now, the issue is that we are not supported to organize our research materials so they are understandable to another scholar or anyone else. And so one of the things I'm doing at Ohio State is we have a grant scheme to support researchers to organize and catalog and digitize their research materials. There'll be a call in December, and I'll send it to the Kennedy Center, because this is something that's happening across disciplines and also all over the world. But there's very few kind of funding mechanisms to support that work.
I'm just curious. I wanted to know, how does the kind of Naga movement for independence compare with like the Kurdish movement for independence in the Middle East? Just kind of, they both hasn't been as successful as some other independence movements. So I was kind of wondering, what is the overlap between those two?
So there is not overlap between Nagas and Kurds. There's often in my research, I have not found much solidarities between nationalist movements. When Nagas are making allusions to other movements, it's almost exclusively on the African continent, and it's almost exclusive during my era. It's because those countries seem like independence is possible, so make an allusion to them. They are not making allusions to Tibetans or Chittagong Hill people or the many other states in waiting in Northeast India and also in Burma, Myanmar. So I know you asked about Kurds, but one might expect to see allusions to the region, and that's not the case. And that's because part of the claim of sovereignty is a claim of uniqueness. Where you really see the connection is between the advocates. So Scott's patron, David Astor, who's the editor of the Observer newspaper, founded an organization that was eventually called the Minority Rights Group. And their founding narrative of themselves is that they were created because of Biafra and the humanitarian crisis surrounding the Biafran War in Nigeria in the late 1960s. But they were actually founded earlier, in the early 60s, in order to handle the Naga claim. And their purpose was to bundle it with a whole host of other claims, including the Kurds, but also including Aboriginal peoples in Australia and including minority nationalisms in Europe. So they wanted, and also indigenous communities in North America. So they were wanting to bundle these claims together. So where you see the kinds of analogies being made is at the level of the advocates, not at the claimants. Also, there are many scholars who've done similar work on Kurds, often using the frame of rebel diplomacy, which is what I call advocacy. And there's a lot of interesting political science scholarship on that, particularly by Morgan Kaplan.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I am wondering about the intersection of religion and this. The Baptist is the number of Baptists there. I spent an afternoon with a Naga woman in Delhi, and we visited an enclave of Nagas there and their food and whatnot. And I was mostly fascinated by how did you go to archives of the Baptist missionaries, just the impact and them as a player in this? As you know, obviously we do a lot of missionary work here, and we become actors in ways that sometimes we're not cognizant of. So I would love to just hear your input on that.
Well, I would like to hear about your Delhi experience, but separate. So yes, the American Baptist missionaries there, it's absolutely integral to the Naga claim, but not in the way the Indian government thinks it is. The Indian government thinks they're these pernicious American ideas of national self-determination that are infiltrating, and no. The American missionaries are not supportive of independence for anybody or any non-Western group, whether they are Indian or Naga. However, they form these really strong personal bonds. And so when someone like Fizo arrives in London, in order to get him regularized, his identity needs to be vouched for. And so you have this whole letter writing campaign among former colonial officials and also American missionaries who are retired, and they correspond with each other. The missionaries, particularly the Suppley family, is in correspondence with Fizo, but George Suppley is also reporting his correspondence to American government circles. So it's also double-edged. The Baptist archives are in Decatur, Georgia. What's really interesting there is because the missionaries, the Americans leave by 53 in the Naga Hills. They remain in Assam and elsewhere longer. The Naga church leadership becomes categorized as missionaries from the perspective of well, it used to be in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, now they're in Georgia, from the perspective of the American Baptist Convention. So their records are kept there, and that was a really incredibly rich repository to explore.
Thank you for staying. One more round of applause.